So we start off talking about this idea of what it means to truly believe in Jesus. And then he goes on in chapter 8, remember, he says, it's not just enough to believe, but we need to be willing to follow. And really willing to have faith to go where Jesus calls us to go. But here's the thing that I don't want us to miss. We were never meant to do it alone. I think a lot of us feel like if I'm following Jesus, then I need to do exactly what Jesus did. And kind of when he started his ministry, it seemed like he was this vigilante that was just like him against the world. You see Jesus surrounded by tax collectors and sinners. You see in chapter 9, it talks about him dining with prostitutes. And a lot of people say, well, then that's what I need to do. If I'm truly going to follow Jesus, then I need to surround myself with like the most wretched people I could find. I need to just go and make friends with the people who are farthest away from God and really surround myself with them to reach them. But let me give you a caution about that. Because here's what we need to realize. First off, Jesus didn't do it alone. He had his disciples with him. And secondly, you're not Jesus. I've seen a lot of people who say, I want to reach the lost, so I'll surround myself with the lost. But then I've witnessed so many of my friends become lost in that environment. I don't know if you live in a community where there's a lake. But where I was growing up, there was this community lake, and there was a boat slip down to it. And I heard the story of a guy who was launching his boat into the lake. And so he's backing it up on his truck. And normally what you would do is you would unhook the boat from the trailer so it's just resting on it. So as the trailer goes into the water, the boat would just float out into the lake. But this person did not do that. And so he's backing into the lake, and the boat is still attached to the trailer. So as the boat becomes buoyant and as it starts to draw back into the lake, it actually pulls his truck down into the water with the boat. Now that's embarrassing enough, and that would be bad enough if that's how the story ended. But what's more funny is there was then this guy who was like, well, I can solve this. I could fix him. And so he got his big monster truck, with a gun rack in the back, I'm sure. And he went down to the boat launch, and he hooked his truck up to the one that was halfway sticking out of the water. And in his mind, he's just going to force that truck out of the water. So he hits the gas and he starts to pull. And as soon as it jostles just a little bit, the truck that's halfway out of the water becomes unsettled. And now it starts drifting even further into the water, pulling the big monster truck down with him. So now there's a boat floating halfway out in the middle of the lake. There's a truck that's fully submerged underwater, and then another truck that's now halfway submerged underwater because they thought that they could just muscle their way out. Actually, how the problem got solved was when a tow truck arrived. And when the tow truck arrived, he didn't hook himself up to the boats in trouble. First, he anchored himself to the tree. He took the winch off the front of his truck and anchored himself to this tree. And then he hooked himself to the trucks that were in trouble. And because he was anchored, he was able to pull those trucks out. Let me ask you, when you're trying to help your friends who are far from God, are you yourself anchored? Before you go to help them, are you truly anchored? Because if you're not, then it is very easy for you to drift as well. May we never forget that Jesus was anchored. He knew who he was and with God. And so the question I want to ask you is, as you're going out to impact this world, as you're going out to surround yourself with people who need help, who are the people helping you? As you're sitting in this room right now, do you know the people to your left and your right? Do you know the people that you're doing ministry with? Why don't you take some time right now to get to know your ministry, to get to know your group, and to encourage each other as you're going out to help those who need it. Now here's the thing. The danger in this is some people allow the pendulum to go way the other way. When I talk about this idea that you need support, this idea that you're not meant to do it by yourself, some people allow that pendulum to swing so far that they only surround themselves by people who look like them, people who believe like them, and people who worship like them. And that's a very real danger. But what Jesus is saying is, no. I want you to go and help the lost, but just don't do it alone. And Jesus models this in Matthew chapter 10. If you have your Bibles, you can turn it to verse 5. But basically, it starts off in this chapter, and Jesus calls his disciples together. He gets the 12 guys that he's going to do ministry with. They walk together, they eat together, they're in community together themselves. But then in verse 5, Jesus starts to send them out. And notice he doesn't send them out alone. It says these 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. And he says, do not go among the Gentiles or enter any home of the Samaritans. Rather, go to the lost sheep of Israel. In the book of Luke, Jesus says he sent them out 2 by 2. And he calls them to go out and to do his work. And he gives them this instruction in verse 11. He says, whatever town or village you enter, search for some worthy person there and stay at his house until you leave. Even as they're going out in twos, it's saying as you go into these environments, you need to be looking for people who are worthy, people who will encourage you. There is power in unity. There is power when we realize as the church that we are not called to seek and save the lost on our own. There is power when we unite and are willing to go out and work together. There are 2 verses that are just jumping off the page at me right now. The first one is Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. And in it, Jesus is talking about the church. And he says that the gates of hell will not be able to withstand my church. And I love that verse. Because oftentimes we think about, our enemy, Satan, as this threat, this person who's out to destroy us. But let me ask you this question. In battle, what are gates used for? Have you ever thought about that? Are gates offensive weapons or defensive weapons? They're defensive, right? We put up gates around our cities to protect us from the people who are coming to attack. And here it says that Satan has his gates up against the church. He is on the defense when we unite. But there's another verse that we need to take very seriously. That's 1 Peter 5:8. And it talks about our enemy. And it says that Satan is like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. It's interesting when you juxtapose those 2 verses. Our enemy devours someone. He's looking on the prowl for someone to devour. But when we unite, he cowers away. The truth is, when we unite as a church, when we unite as a ministry, that moment is the moment when heaven and earth collide. That is the moment where you can go out and impact those who are far from God.
We're talking about community and surrounding yourself with the right influences and being workers for the kingdom together. We believe that there's some incredible things that you have done and you will do when you work together. This next challenge is for you to do as a group. We want you to circle up and to take some time to write out all the accomplishments and the wins that you guys have done together over the past year for the kingdom. If that was to raise money to fight the water crisis in Africa, write it down. If that was seeing so-and-so being baptized, write it down. If that was starting a Bible study at your school, write it down. The next part, we want you to discuss as a group why you are able to do these things together, or we want you to talk about what is holding your group back from doing some incredible things for the kingdom. When we live together and hear Jesus' words about community and we surround ourselves with other workers for the kingdom, we are helping to make heaven and earth collide here and now and in your church and in your community.